Hi guys, I'm here today to talk about 6 of the 12 books I read in the month of April. I've decided to split this wrap up into 2 videos so that I don't ramble on forever, and in this video I'm talking about the fiction. So I was trying to participate in 3 readathons in April. You may remember that if you saw my TBR, if not I'll link it up here. And I was aiming to read around 20 books. When we got partway through April, about 2 weeks in, I read 9 books, so I was on target to read 20 and I was very excited and massively geeking out. And then, as I've mentioned to you guys before, I'm bored of hearing myself say it, so I'm sure you're bored of hearing it. I've had some problems with my elbows and wrists, I think from working at a shoddy desk from home and probably spending too much time sitting in an armchair reading, in not a very good sitting position, to be honest. I'm a bit sloth-ish, so probably doesn't help. I've had some issues and not been able to read a ton for the last couple of weeks. So I didn't manage to do as well as I hoped to with the readathons. But I did read 9 out of the 12 OWL prompts, and then I think I cleared quite a few books off my TBR. I may have only read 1 or 2 books off my physical TBR, but I DNF'd about 5, so that's got rid of a few. And I only managed to read 3 Aussie April books, which was a real shame, but I had a lot of them put aside for the second half of the month, and as I said, just didn't read as much. So firstly, I'm going to talk about a couple of rereads. I put aside a lot of my favourite graphic novels and memoirs to reread this year. I'm really trying to reread more, and it didn't make any sense to me that I had these graphic novels and memoirs that I'd loved and never reread because, it doesn't take long. So I thought I would read a couple of those this month because I wanted to read them, and also they ticked off some of the subjects for the OWLs. So one of them is Skim by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki. Mariko and Jillian are cousins, and this was their debut graphic novel together, I think. Mariko wrote the story and Jillian did the artwork. So I gave this 4 stars the first time I read it, and I actually knocked this one down a star. That sounds bad, but actually I'm doing that a lot with these graphic rereads, and that's because I used to be a much more generous star rater and I'm just a stingy bitch now, so I still enjoyed this one. This is set in a 90s high school in Canada, and we follow Kim as she is struggling with quite a few different things really. She seems to be struggling with depression. Her best friend and her have a sort of fraught relationship. Her best friend isn't particularly nice, she's quite bitchy. Kim's trying to be a witch, so she's got really into tarot cards, and she tries to go and join this group of middle-aged witches in her local community, and it doesn't really work out. And she also has feelings for her art teacher, and so she's not sure if she's queer. And at the same time as all this is happening, a young boy in her high school commits suicide, and a group of girls become really obsessed with the drama of that and start to really, I guess, pick on his ex-girlfriend who isn't coping well with his death. And it follows, all those characters with Kim as the focal point, and where the story goes from there. I really love the art style of this, and I think it's quite nostalgic, like I said, it's set in the 90s, and I certainly enjoyed it. But on a reread, I really struggled with the bitchiness of it. Throughout this, there's a lot of bitchy things said by Kim's best friend, by this group of girls, but also by Kim herself. And, the story sort of comes full circle, and we're left with this somewhat positive ending. But even in that positive ending, there was a bitchy comment about another girl, which just wasn't necessary. So I felt like we weren't left with learning from reading this that, be kind to the girls and don't judge them. And I think maybe this is just a tad dated in that respect. I think if something like that came out now, that isn't how we'd be left with it. But this came out in 2008, and I think we weren't thinking as complexly about those issues as we are now. So I'd still recommend this, but just be aware that it's not the kindest graphic novel you could read. I decided to also reread their other graphic novel, which is This One Summer, again by Jillian and Mariko Tamaki. This one came out much more recently, and I absolutely loved this one the first time I read it, and this one definitely stands up much better than Skim, so I'd 100% say to go for this one. It deals with similar themes. We're following Rose, who's around 13. She goes to her parents' summer house by the beach, and every year she sees her friend Windy, who's about a year and a half younger, and Windy goes to her summer house with her mother and grandmother, and they all spend their summers together. And they've got to a certain age where Rose is feeling much more mature, and she feels like Windy's really childish, and also Rose's parents have some things going on which is making their relationship quite fraught, and Rose is sort of acting out because of that. So again, we're dealing with a character who is bitchy in a way that persecutes girls. So she keeps calling girls around her age and older sluts. She's really condescending. She says really mean things about girls. But the wonderful thing about this one is that the younger character, Windy, is a breath of fresh air. Like, she's given as this feminist, body positive, smart, sassy, like zero fucks given 11-year-old, and she's a delight. And the balance of that against Rose, you know, it does have that full circle feel of Rose sort of realises that she's not being the kindest, and it's not like really over the top and in your face, it's done in a nice subtle way. But again, this deals with issues of depression, teen pregnancy, and other issues that are going on with her family that I don't really want to spoil. But I think this is really beautiful. It's really beautifully drawn, like similar art style, but this one is prettier, I'd say. This one is done in lilac throughout, and there's lots of beach scenes, there's lots of scenes of them dancing. Here's one of the beach scenes in particular when her mother's teaching her to swim. It's just really lovely. So I gave this one 4 stars. As I said, I gave it 5 stars the first time I read it, but I'm just meaner now, but I definitely recommend this one. The next one we have is Toffee by Sarah Crossan. I don't really have much to say about this one. I picked this one up quite recently because I read and really enjoyed One by this author, and so I thought I'd give her newest book a go, and I was quite disappointed in this. I thought it was just okay, and it's going to be one of the books I read this year that I really easily forget. This is about a young girl, I think she's around 16, and her father is violent and abusive, and so she runs away from home, and she ends up going into a house that she thinks is abandoned and quickly realising that it isn't, and actually there's an older lady who lives there who seems to have memory problems, and she confuses her with somebody else, and it's about what our protagonist does following that. This is told in like poetry style, like One was, but not as beautifully. I found One really emotive, really impactful. I didn't find this that at all. I also find it just a tad unbelievable, and I just never really truly connected to the characters and didn't find them memorable. So yeah, this was just sort of a forgettable read for me, and I'd if you have to read one of them, 100% read One over Toffee. The next couple of books I'm going to talk about I read for Aussie April, and the first one is From the Wreck by Jane Rawson. This is the advanced reader's copy of it. It actually came out about a year ago in the UK, so it does have a much prettier cover in the finished edition. And this is one of the books I'd owned for a while, so I was really glad to finally get to it. This is set in the mid-1800s in Australia. It's a very odd story, and I don't really want to give much away. It follows a man on a shipwreck, and he survives the shipwreck with a woman who he isn't really sure if she's a woman, and he refers to her as the creature. And he has fears that this creature may have followed him and be interested in his son. And we also read snippets from the creature's perspective, which are really well written and really interesting. And we also read snippets from his young son's perspective, and there is some stuff going on with this creature. So I thought this was a really great idea. To put science fiction in a historical setting makes so much sense. Like, there's no reason that if creatures come from somewhere else, they're going to do it in contemporary times. They're just as likely to have done it hundreds of years ago. So I thought that was a great choice, and I thought it was really well handled. The sections from the creature's perspective could have been really bizarre and just not worked, and I think they really did. I think they really got me in the mindset of what this creature's thought process might be, and their desires and their wants. My issues with this were that I never really truly cared about any of the characters. I thought the young boy, the son, was really well written, and I really liked the moments he had with his younger brother and with his aunt and uncle, but this just never pushed me over into believing they were any more than characters in a book and making me truly care about what happened to them. And I think that's a big part of the book. Like, you need to care what happens to them, because if not, what the creature or the father does are irrelevant. And I think the reasons this book isn't super successful, the reasons you don't connect to the characters enough, is that I just don't think this book is long enough. It is 250 pages in this edition, and it's dealing with this really original concept. It has to ground you in the you know, the time period and the place. And I just don't think you can do all that in 250 pages. I think this book should have been 50 or 100 pages longer, and I think it would be a much stronger book for that. You know, I find that interesting because most of the time I'd say that books should be shorter, that an editor hasn't done their job properly and should have cut more out. But actually with this book, I think it needed to be longer. So I enjoyed it. I'd give it like 3.5 stars, and I'd be interested to see what else she brings out. But I think this could have been a much stronger novel. The next one is The Van Apfel Girls Are Gone by Felicity McLean. I was quite disappointed in this one. This was a completely average, fine read. Like, I got it from the library, it was really easy to get through, it wasn't at all offensive, but also super forgettable. I feel like it did nothing new with the topic it was dealing with. So this is about a woman in our contemporary time who has been living in, I don't remember, maybe New York, and she gets a call that her sister is ill, so she decides to go back to Australia to go visit her family. And when she gets back there, she starts to think about these 3 girls who lived across the street from them when they were children, called the Van Apfel Girls. And those 3 girls, who are sisters, all went missing. And so the majority of the book is going back to when that happened and looking at the friendship between these 2 groups of sisters and looking at what happened and like why these girls went missing and who may have been involved. So in the UK, this has been marketed as a thriller. I mean, it says on the front, a smart, classy thriller that blazes with the heat of Australia. This is not a thriller. It's really slow. If you want to know what happens to these girls, if that's the sort of reader you are, you're not going to get that from this book. This is more like a, these are all the things that could have happened. Who knows? And also, I feel like with the things that could have happened, it just felt unbearably tropey. So we have this really strictly religious father who's obviously a bit abusive, so it could be him. And we also have a male teacher who seems a bit too interested in one of the sisters, so it could be him. And I feel like they're 2 of the biggest tropes in the book in terms of girls go missing, who could have been involved. So I felt like that was a bit of a shame. And also that the writing style is nothing special, it's just like run of the mill. But one thing that really bothered me is the author seems to have a real obsession with using brackets unnecessarily. At some points I'd look at a double page spread and there'd be like 5 brackets and none of them were needed. I don't know why she used so many brackets. And the problem is when you notice something like that, you can't unnotice it. So that became quite infuriating. I'd say she did it less towards the second half of the novel, but I don't know, maybe I just got fed up with picking up on it. So this was like a 2-star read for me. Like I said, there's nothing offensive about it. I think it's a fine book to get out from the library and give a go, but it's one of those books that if I had to return this to the library, then I wouldn't have taken it out again to finish it. I'd have just been like, oh well, I'm not going to finish that one. So that was a bit of a shame. And then lastly, we do have a book I absolutely loved, which I think is required after a few of those, and that is The Glorious Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell. I could bang on about this one forever, but I feel like you're going to hear quite a lot about it. I mean, it's made the Women's Prize shortlist, and also it's Maggie O'Farrell, you know, she's a really celebrated author, and also it's to do with Shakespeare. So people are going to be reading it, people are going to be talking about it. So I'm going to talk about it, probably for a while, but I'm going to try and not run on for too long. So I've read a couple of Maggie O'Farrell novels, and I've also read her memoir, and I want to make my way through the rest of her work. When I heard that she had a book coming out that was historical fiction, I was like, intriguing, I'd love to read her do historical fiction. I think she's done a blend before, but never a book that's just straight historical fiction. When I heard it was to do with Shakespeare, I was like, oh God, I'm not really interested in Shakespeare. If you feel that way, please do not avoid this book, because it is and it isn't about Shakespeare. And the question I find really interesting with this is that you can ask, I was telling Johnny all about this book, and the question he asked is, why does it need to be about Shakespeare? Why couldn't it have been about some made up playwright? And I get that question, but I can answer it. So, if you don't know, this is set around the life of Shakespeare and his family, particularly his son Hamnet. So he had a son who died when he was 11, and several years later the play Hamlet came out. Hamlet is basically another version of the name Hamnet. So Maggie O'Farrell has decided to write a novel that focuses on the idea the play Hamlet was inspired by the loss of his son Hamnet. The first 2/3 of this novel are super tense because you know the boy is going to die and you know it's going to be devastating, but she makes it harder for you to deal with that because she goes back in time and gives you the history of this family and shows you how much they all love and adore one another and how they're just wonderful people, and then goes, God, you've spent 200 pages with these people, you love them, now deal with it. So that's absolutely devastating. So firstly, let's deal with why does it have to be about William Shakespeare. He's unnamed throughout, which may sound like a bit of a a cheap trick in order to be like, oh god, I've just read a book about Shakespeare but he's never actually named. And I get it can sound like that, but it really isn't, because what this is about, it's about him as a father and a husband and not a playwright, and therefore his famous name is irrelevant. And I feel like by putting his famous name in there, you would take away from the fact that he was also a father and a husband. We don't ever think of him in those terms, we always think of him as a playwright. And so I feel like this was Maggie O'Farrell in a way giving to him the roles we never discussed. The reason I think this had to be Shakespeare and nobody else is because a big part of this novel is that his wife Agnes is illiterate. She cannot read or write very well at all. She lives in a very small village. She doesn't understand his success in London. And if this was an unknown playwright, a made-up person, then Maggie O'Farrell would have to somehow tell us that. She'd have to explain it to us, and she doesn't, because we have the context, even with knowing as little about Shakespeare as I do, we have the context to read the book and to know more than his family know about him. And that really changes the dynamic of the narrative. And so that's why I think it's important that it is Shakespeare and that he isn't named. So they're two just great choices that were super intelligent, that were handled brilliantly, that I just wanted to highlight. But other than that, this is absolutely gloriously written. Not everybody is going to like this. It is very descriptive, it's very lyrical, it's filled with metaphors and similes and long beautiful lyrical passages. I love all that, not everybody is going to. You can tell I loved it by the amount of tabs, it's absolutely ridiculous. So I'm going to know a buddy reading this, and we had such joy in being like, oh my god, what did you think of this beautiful passage? And just reading them out to one another, because it's just a pure delight. Something else I think is really important to highlight is I listened to Maggie O'Farrell on a podcast talk about this book, and she said one of the things that she always found frustrating was that people spoke about Shakespeare's wife and they said, you know, she was a bit older than him, she was illiterate, she was from a farming family, and look at who Shakespeare was, like why did he marry her? And she wanted to flip that, and she wanted to ask the question, why would she marry him? You know, at the time she was a few years older than him, and when she married him, she was from a farming family who were very wealthy, much wealthier than his family were. She also had a massive dowry, and he had no career. He had no real training in anything. He hadn't started even thinking about being a playwright, and so he brought nothing to the table. And so we're given this phenomenal woman. Like, Agnes is one of the most beautiful, amazing characters I've ever read. I just absolutely adored her, and I would read like a 1000-page book just about her. She was so brilliant. And so this book is about Hamnet the boy, and yes, is about Shakespeare the father, but more than anything it's about Agnes the mother and the wife, and what she goes through losing her son, and it is absolutely devastating. The way this is written, like, it's scary, it's heartbreaking, it's joyful, it's warm, and what I loved about this is written in such a way that there's things that Shakespeare does that you don't like him for. You know, you feel like he lets his family down, but at the same time she allows you to see these people's faults but still love them, to still see the warmth in these people through their love of one another. And I think that's a really hard thing to do, to give you a person who's done things that are unkind and unfair and selfish, and to still somehow make you love them and be able to forgive them for it in just 300 pages. And I think that's a really talented thing to be able to do. So I thought this was a masterpiece, absolutely loved it. I could literally just pick it back up and read it again right now. It's so brilliant, and I hope more people read it. I'm sure they will, but I'd love to hear more people talk about this one, and I think this would be an excellent book club pick, so cannot wait to hear you all rave about this one. And I know I had so many tabs in that book and didn't read a single one of them, but it's just, I wouldn't have even known which one to go for because they're all so beautiful. So I really hope you give it a go. It's, you know, lots of beautiful descriptions of the land. Agnes is really connected to the land, and so there's lots of beautiful nature writing. Just, yeah, I'm gonna run on even more. So I loved it, it's beautiful. Please get yourself a copy of it and give it a read. So those are all the books I read in April. I don't think the fiction reading was that successful, but obviously I loved Hamnet and it made up for, you know, some of the others that weren't quite as enjoyable. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these, if you have, what you thought of them, and I'd also love to know what your favourite novel of the month was. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!